Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Smash JT. In this episode, I want to pose the question to everybody out there, what makes something collectible? And specifically in the video game realm, because I've been looking at a lot of NES games recently. I'm somewhat of a collector with a lot of retro games, like NES games, Super Nintendo games, and especially N64 games. And I started wondering why I wasn't collecting for other systems, like Atari, or the Sega Master System, or even the Sega Genesis for that matter. Yes, I have games for all of them, but I've never been drawn to wanting to collect more, or go for an entire set, or any kind of reason of collecting a specific genre of game for any other system. So I got to wondering, why do we collect for specific things, and why do the overwhelming majority of retro gamers out there seem to seek out Nintendo? JT. To kick things off, the Atari 2600 released originally in 1982, and they went on to sell over 30 million units. It was in production until January 1st, 1992. The Atari 2600 created an entire generation of gamers. So it makes me wonder why people don't look back fondly on the 2600 and have crazy good memories of the games that were on that system to begin with. Especially when you compare it to the original NES, which debuted on July 15th, 1983 in Japan, and then later in North America 1985 and in Europe 1986. So if the NES came out a few years after the Atari and was in production up until 1995 in North America, why do people want more NES games than Atari games? Is it because the games were more complex? If that's the case, why are people collecting for the NES instead of the Super NES? Or, instead of the Super NES, the Sega Genesis, or the Nintendo 64, or the Sony PlayStation? Is it because the longevity of the actual hardware and software is better, where people are worried about disc rot with things like the PlayStation and Dreamcast, compared to where people think that the NES, Super Nintendo, and N64 will last pretty much forever? Overall, NES carts can hold their value just as well as Super Nintendo carts, or N64 carts for that matter. So it's not necessarily a when it came out kind of thing, nor is it a what kind of technology was available kind of thing. There's something special about the original Nintendo and why it's become so collectible. Many will argue it's because Nintendo is still around present day, where they have a certain nostalgia for the brand, but that doesn't really make much sense when compared to things like Sega that stopped making consoles even though they're still making software, or when you compare it to Atari, which we're not even going to get into what's wrong with Atari's brand name right now, but suffice it to say, they're not making consoles anymore. Yeah, I said it. The Atari's not making consoles anymore. And don't even come at me with the Atari VCS, because until that thing actually comes into existence and is made on retail shelves and sold to people, I'm not believing it's even going to be a real thing. And even if it is a real thing, it's not really the brand of Atari making it. Someone bought the rights of Atari's name to slap it on another box, so it's a lot different than what it actually means coming from the originator. Like Nintendo, the same company that brought us the original NES, is bringing us the Nintendo Switch. And there's definitely something to be said about that. But then if you look back at the original Xbox compared to the Xbox One, there's not much collectability on the original Xbox titles, so I don't really know how much that actually matters. Some people might say that it's the brand name of the characters in the games, where there's a certain level of recognizability with the characters of, say, Mario, or Link, or Samus, that has been through all these different transitions of games throughout the years, and they want to look fondly back on the originals because that's where they got their start. But if that's the case, why isn't it Donkey Kong on the original Atari selling for a lot more? Because isn't that where Mario got his start as Jumpman? So I don't know how much that matters either. My point is, there are a number of reasons why someone would collect for a specific console over another one, but I seem to keep getting stuck on this matter of Why are people collecting for the NES so much? Is it because the games were not very valuable a few years ago and now they have a tremendous amount of value, so everyone's getting caught up in the rat race of trying to play the game of collectability and getting these games before they skyrocket in price, and because they're doing that, they're increasing the market demand for these games that they don't necessarily want in the first place? That could actually be part of the reason why these NES games keep going up in value. But if that's the case, that's not actually a true value for what these games are naturally worth in the collectible realm, which means that the bubble on them will burst sooner or later. There's no way that could possibly keep up, especially at the rate that it's going. While many people may argue that YouTubers are artificially increasing the demand on a lot of these retro games, and the focus of these YouTube channels is always on NES games because that's where the collectability is, I get to start wondering of, that's one of those chicken or the egg type things. Is it the YouTube channels creating the content making people want to go out and get these NES games? Or is it people going out and getting these NES games and wanting more information on them, so YouTubers are then reacting, making the videos to fill the need created by these collectors in the first place? Fact of the matter is, there are a ton of different reasons why somebody would choose to collect for one console over another one. But I'm still going back to this hard question of, why does nobody really collect for the Atari 2600? I see them at yard sales all the time. I pick them up because I like them, and they're not really worth very much. And that's fine, because I don't really collect things for their value. I collect them because of the nostalgia, and I love video games. But it's always funny to me that I see these boxes of Atari games and cartridges, and nobody seems to care about them, or if they do, they're not valued very much at all. I mean, yeah, you'll get your 1 or 2 Atari games that are worth upwards of $25 or $50, maybe, thanks to Ready Player One and the game Adventure and things like that. But outside of things like those titles, most of the games are $1 a piece or less, and nobody seems to care about wanting to raise the value on those. And it's not just limited to Atari, but that's the one that comes to mind so often because these games are, to me, very fun games. River Raid, Yar's Revenge, Kaboom, so many awesome titles on the Atari 2600. People will say, the games were okay, but they weren't really as good as what the NES brought to us. But again, I go back to what I said earlier. The games on the NES weren't as good as what the Super Nintendo brought to us. So I don't know how much that argument really holds weight. Some people may say that the Atari crash really jaded the people that were gamers back in the day, and that generation has now grown up, and now they don't look back fondly on video games because they got so hurt during the crash that they don't want to even revisit those games again. And maybe there's something to that, but that doesn't necessarily explain why the Sega Master System isn't as collectible as the NES is. And people may say, well, there are more people who had an NES, so they have more nostalgia for the NES because of that reason. Which may be true, but I guess that means there's a multitude of factors combining together here, creating this weird intersection where everyone goes back to the NES to collect for it. Now, many of you may watch this video and say, I collect for the Sega Master System, or I collect for Atari. That's not necessarily true. You really need to take a step outside yourself and look at the situation for what it is. There are more people collecting for the NES by far than any other console out there. And the reason for that is a multitude of factors. But I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about this down in the comments. Why do you collect for the NES? Why don't you collect for the Atari? Is it because you don't think there's any value in those games and you don't want to collect them and take up room in your house because there's no reason to do so, because there's no value at the end of the day after holding on to them for so long? And that's okay if you collect for value. I'm not going to judge, but that's a legitimate reason a lot of people may have for it. But I don't really necessarily agree with that. I'm just saying that's probably why most people don't collect for the Atari in the first place. I'm going to leave the video right there, but again, let me know your thoughts on this. I'd be very interested to hear. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good one.
Now you can play Donkey Kong on your ColecoVision, Atari VCS, or Intellivision video game system. Donkey Kong has multiple screens, just like the arcade game.
You're not gonna stop me, you stupid ape!
Play Donkey Kong on your ColecoVision, Atari VCS, or Intellivision video game system.
Don't worry, darling! I'll save you!